Margaret Lawson never imagined that one quiet evening would become the moment she would remember for the rest of her life, because at 62 her world had become simple and predictable, the kind of peaceful life she once prayed for after years of raising a child, supporting her husband, and learning how to live alone after his passing. She lived in a small Vermont town where mornings began with birds singing near her kitchen window and evenings ended with a warm cup of tea beside the fireplace. And although the house sometimes felt too quiet, Margaret had learned to fill her days with gardening, reading, and volunteering at the local library, but the center of her life had always been her daughter Emily, the one person who made every lonely year easier to carry, and seeing Emily happy had always been Margaret's greatest comfort. Emily was 33, hardworking and kind, and she had built a life she was proud of, working long shifts as a nurse while sharing a home with her husband Daniel, a man Margaret had trusted from the moment she first met him, because Daniel had always seemed calm, respectful, and thoughtful, the kind of man who opened doors, remembered birthdays, and spoke with gentle patience even when conversations became difficult. And over the 6 years he had been part of the family, Margaret had often told friends that Emily was lucky to have found someone so steady. Their visits were always warm and comfortable, Sunday dinners filled with laughter, simple stories, and the peaceful feeling of family sitting around the same table. And whenever Daniel visited Margaret's house he treated her with the same kindness he showed Emily, carrying groceries, fixing loose cabinet doors, and asking if she needed anything before leaving. And for a long time Margaret truly believed life had settled into a safe and familiar pattern where nothing surprising could happen anymore. However, life rarely announces when change begins, because sometimes it enters quietly through small moments that seem harmless at first, and Margaret began noticing those moments slowly during the past year when Emily's work schedule became more demanding than ever, long hospital shifts that often stretched late into the night, leaving Daniel alone at home many evenings, and occasionally he would stop by Margaret's house after work, sometimes to drop off groceries Emily had ordered online for her mother, sometimes to check a small repair in the house, and sometimes simply because he said he was already nearby. And Margaret never thought twice about these visits because she trusted him completely and appreciated the company, especially on evenings when the silence of the house felt heavier than usual. They would sit at the kitchen table with cups of coffee while sunlight faded behind the trees outside, talking about simple things like books they had read, places they had traveled, or funny stories about Emily's childhood that Daniel had never heard before, and those conversations felt natural, comfortable, and friendly, the kind of conversations two family members could easily share without thinking too deeply about them. Yet slowly Margaret began noticing small details that left her slightly uneasy, though she could never explain exactly why, like the way Daniel sometimes watched her while she spoke, not in a rude or obvious way, but with a quiet focus that felt more serious than casual conversation, or the way he sometimes seemed nervous when Emily's name came up in certain discussions, quickly changing the topic or laughing to avoid deeper questions. And once when Margaret handed him a cup of tea their hands touched briefly and Daniel pulled back quickly as if the moment surprised him, leaving an awkward silence hanging in the air for just a second longer than it should have lasted. But Margaret pushed these feelings aside each time because she believed she was simply overthinking harmless moments, reminding herself that Daniel loved Emily and had always been a good husband to her daughter, and Margaret had no reason to doubt that. Still, something subtle had changed in the way their conversations felt, a quiet tension that Margaret could not fully explain but could not ignore either, and the moment that finally made her question everything arrived one rainy evening in early October when a strong storm rolled through town, dark clouds covering the sky long before sunset while heavy rain fell across the streets. And Margaret had just finished watering her plants when the doorbell rang unexpectedly, and when she opened the door Daniel stood there soaked from the rain, his jacket dripping water onto the porch while thunder echoed in the distance, and he gave a tired smile while explaining that Emily was working another late shift and he had been driving nearby when the storm became too strong to continue safely. so he decided to stop by for a few minutes until the rain slowed down. And Margaret welcomed him inside without hesitation because that was what family did. She handed him a towel and started making hot coffee while the storm grew louder outside. And soon they were sitting by the window watching rain fall heavily across the yard while wind shook the branches of the tall maple trees, their conversation beginning as normally as always, talking about the weather, Emily's busy work schedule, and the quiet changes of autumn in their small town. But gradually the room became quieter as Daniel stared out the window for longer stretches without speaking, his expression thoughtful in a way Margaret had not seen before. And after a while he sighed softly and said that lately he felt like he and Emily barely had time to see each other because of her long hospital shifts, and Margaret listened carefully because she understood how demanding Emily's career had become, reminding Daniel gently that marriages often passed through busy seasons where life became stressful, but those moments usually did not last forever. Yet when she finished speaking, Daniel looked at her with a strange seriousness that made her suddenly uncomfortable, and after a moment he said something simple but unexpected, telling Margaret that she was easy to talk to and that their conversations helped him relax more than he expected. And although the words sounded harmless on the surface, the tone behind them carried something deeper that Margaret immediately recognized. Something personal that did not belong in the relationship between a mother-in-law and her daughter's husband, and the moment stretched in silence as Daniel continued watching her instead of looking away, and Margaret felt an uneasy weight settle in her chest because she suddenly understood that the line between friendly conversation and something more complicated had begun to blur. So she stood up quickly and began clearing the coffee cups from the table while speaking casually about the storm outside, suggesting Daniel should probably head home before the roads became flooded, and Daniel nodded slowly as if he understood her attempt to end the evening, putting on his jacket and walking toward the door while thunder rumbled again across the sky. Yet just before leaving he paused and called Margaret's name in a quiet voice, and when she turned to face him he looked like someone about to say something important but uncertain whether he should. His expression conflicted for a few long seconds before he finally shook his head and simply said goodnight instead, stepping outside into the rain and closing the door behind him, leaving Margaret standing alone in the quiet house as the storm continued outside. And although nothing truly dramatic had happened, she could not shake the uneasy feeling that something invisible had shifted between them that night, something small yet powerful enough to change the way she would look at Daniel from that moment forward. And as Margaret washed the coffee cups in the sink, she told herself she was imagining things and that everything would feel normal again tomorrow, but deep in her heart she sensed that a line had come dangerously close to being crossed, and she had no idea that this quiet evening was only the beginning of a story that would one day haunt her memories for years to come. After the rainy evening that left Margaret uneasy, she tried to convince herself that nothing unusual had happened and that Daniel's strange behavior had only been the result of stress and exhaustion. Because Emily's work schedule had been overwhelming lately and Daniel often spent evenings alone while she worked long hospital shifts, so Margaret returned to her quiet routine and focused on the simple things that had always brought her peace, like tending the small flowers in her backyard, organizing books at the town library, and calling Emily every few days to check how she was doing. Yet even as life continued normally, Margaret could not completely forget the look Daniel had given her that night before leaving in the rain, a look filled with hesitation and something deeper she did not want to understand. For several weeks Daniel did not visit Margaret alone again, which made her believe the uncomfortable moment had quietly passed, but whenever the family gathered for dinner Margaret noticed subtle changes in him, the way he spoke less than usual, the way his eyes sometimes drifted toward her during conversations before he quickly looked away, and although Emily seemed too busy to notice these small details, Margaret could sense the tension growing quietly beneath the surface. She reminded herself again and again that Daniel loved Emily and had always treated her well, and Margaret refused to believe anything serious could threaten their marriage. But the uneasy feeling returned one evening in late October when Emily called her while driving home from work, sounding tired but cheerful at the same time. explaining that she had ordered new shelves for the living room and needed to clear space in the house. So she had asked Daniel to bring a few boxes of old books to Margaret's place for storage until the new shelves arrived, and Margaret agreed without hesitation because helping her daughter had always been natural for her, even though a small voice inside her wondered whether being alone with Daniel again would bring back the strange tension she had tried so hard to forget. Later that evening Daniel arrived carrying 2 heavy boxes filled with Emily's old college books, greeting Margaret politely as always while stepping inside from the cool autumn air, and everything about his behavior seemed normal at first as they placed the boxes in the living room and began sorting through them together, laughing softly at some of Emily's old notes written inside textbooks and remembering stories from her college years. But after a while the conversation slowed and a quiet pause settled between them as Daniel sat at the kitchen table holding a cup of tea Margaret had prepared, staring down at the steam rising from the cup as if searching for the right words to say something he had been thinking about for a long time. Finally he looked up and asked Margaret if he could ask her something personal, and although the request surprised her she nodded politely because she believed he might simply need advice about something related to Emily or work. Yet the question he asked next felt heavier than she expected when he wondered out loud whether people ever reached a point in life where things did not turn out the way they once imagined. And Margaret understood the sadness hidden inside those words because she had experienced many unexpected changes in her own life, especially after losing her husband years earlier. So she answered honestly that everyone eventually faces moments when life moves in directions they never planned. And Daniel listened carefully before leaning back in his chair and explaining that he cared deeply about Emily but lately felt like their lives were moving in different directions because her work kept her constantly busy while he spent long evenings alone at home wondering whether their connection was slowly fading. Margaret responded gently, reminding him that many couples face difficult seasons when work and responsibilities create distance, but those moments do not always define the future of a marriage, and she encouraged him to talk openly with Emily because honest conversations often help couples understand each other better. But Daniel hesitated before responding, explaining that Emily already carried so much stress from her demanding job that he did not want to burden her with his worries. And the room fell quiet again as Margaret realized the conversation was becoming more emotional than she had expected. Then Daniel said something that made Margaret's heart tighten slightly when he told her that she had become the easiest person for him to talk to lately, someone who understood him without judgment, and although the words sounded respectful the meaning behind them carried a tone Margaret immediately recognized as dangerous, because there are certain boundaries within families that must never become blurred no matter how innocent a conversation may seem, and she suddenly felt the same uncomfortable tension she had experienced during the rainy evening weeks earlier. Margaret looked at Daniel carefully and spoke with calm firmness, telling him that loneliness and stress can sometimes confuse emotions, especially when people are searching for someone who listens and offers comfort, but those feelings should never replace the connection he needed to rebuild with his wife. And Daniel seemed embarrassed by her response, quickly apologizing and saying he never meant to create an awkward situation, yet he also admitted that his thoughts had become complicated recently and he had been trying to understand them himself. Margaret stood up from the table at that moment because she wanted to end the conversation before it crossed a line that could not be undone, and she told Daniel clearly that he was simply overwhelmed and needed rest rather than deeper discussions about feelings that did not belong between them, and Daniel nodded quietly, realizing she was right and that he had allowed frustration and loneliness to guide his words in a direction he never intended. The tension between them grew heavy as Daniel reached for his coat and walked toward the door, apologizing again for making her uncomfortable and promising he respected her too much to continue the conversation further. And Margaret accepted the apology but remained serious, reminding him that his marriage to Emily was the most important relationship he needed to protect, and Daniel agreed without hesitation, saying he would focus on repairing the distance that had formed between him and Emily rather than allowing confusing emotions to distract him. He then stepped outside into the cold evening air and closed the door gently behind him, leaving Margaret alone in the quiet house once again. But this time the silence felt different because she knew something significant had almost happened even though nothing truly inappropriate had taken place, and as she stood by the window watching Daniel's car disappear down the street, she realized how fragile trust can be when emotions begin drifting in the wrong direction. Margaret spent the rest of the evening thinking carefully about everything that had been said, replaying the conversation in her mind and wondering whether she should tell Emily about it or simply let the moment fade away as a misunderstanding that Daniel already regretted, because in truth he had not done anything beyond speaking words he should have kept to himself, yet those words carried enough meaning to create a quiet crack in the perfect image Margaret once had of her daughter's marriage. By the time Margaret finally went to bed that night, she had made one decision clearly in her heart: she would not allow this situation to grow into something harmful for her daughter, and if Daniel ever attempted to cross that emotional line again she would stop it immediately, because protecting Emily's happiness mattered more to Margaret than anything else in the world. Yet even as she closed her eyes she could not ignore the troubling realization that some lines, once approached even briefly, leave behind a memory that is difficult to erase, and although Daniel had walked away respectfully that evening, Margaret knew their relationship would never feel completely the same again, because both of them now understood that a boundary had been tested, and the quiet peace their family once shared had become more fragile than either of them had ever expected. After that uncomfortable evening, Margaret hoped the situation would quietly disappear from their lives, but the memory stayed with her like a shadow she could not completely escape, and the following weeks felt strangely tense even though nothing unusual happened on the surface. She continued visiting Emily and Daniel for dinner sometimes, smiling and asking about their work. Yet inside she watched Daniel carefully without meaning to, wondering if he regretted the words he had spoken or if the feelings behind them still existed somewhere beneath his calm behavior, and Daniel seemed to understand that something delicate had happened between them because he acted more careful than before, speaking politely but never staying alone in a room with Margaret longer than necessary. And when family dinners ended he usually focused his attention on Emily or busying himself with small tasks like washing dishes or taking out the trash, and Margaret appreciated the effort because it showed he respected the boundary she had drawn. Yet the silence between them also created a quiet tension that neither of them knew how to fully erase. Emily remained completely unaware of the emotional storm that had almost touched her marriage, and she continued sharing stories about her long hospital shifts, her plans to apply for a promotion, and her dreams of starting a family one day. And each time Margaret listened she felt a small weight in her chest because she wondered whether keeping the secret was protecting her daughter or hiding something important from her. But every time the thought of telling Emily crossed her mind, Margaret imagined the heartbreak it could cause, the confusion, the anger, the loss of trust between people who loved each other, and she decided again and again that silence was the safer choice for everyone. Daniel also seemed determined to move forward and repair his marriage quietly because he began making more effort to spend time with Emily whenever she was free from work, cooking dinner for her after long shifts or planning small weekend trips outside town. And Margaret noticed these changes with cautious relief because they showed Daniel was trying to rebuild the closeness he once feared was fading. For a while life almost returned to normal, and Margaret allowed herself to believe the problem had been nothing more than a difficult moment caused by loneliness and stress. But then winter arrived earlier than expected, bringing heavy snow to their small Vermont town and changing the quiet rhythm of daily life again. One evening in early December, Emily called Margaret sounding slightly worried because a strong snowstorm was already moving across the state and she had just been asked to cover an overnight shift at the hospital, which meant she would not be home until the next morning. And during the conversation Emily suddenly remembered that a package she had ordered online had been delivered by mistake to Margaret's address instead of her own house, so she asked if Daniel could drive over quickly to pick it up before the roads became too dangerous later in the night, and Margaret hesitated for a moment when she heard the request because the thought of being alone with Daniel again made her uneasy, yet she did not want to create suspicion by refusing such a simple favor. so she agreed and told Emily she would be waiting for him. Outside, the snow began falling harder with each passing hour, covering the streets in thick white layers while icy wind shook the trees, and when Daniel finally arrived at Margaret's house, his car tires crunched loudly against the frozen driveway as he stepped out wearing a heavy coat, greeting Margaret politely while brushing snow from his shoulders, and everything felt normal at first as Margaret handed him the package Emily had mentioned, but when Daniel checked his phone for the weather update, his expression changed slightly as he realized the storm had grown much worse than expected, with warnings already appearing about dangerous road conditions across the area. Margaret looked out the window and saw the swirling snow blocking the streetlights, and she knew immediately that driving far in that weather could be risky, so she suggested Daniel stay for a while until the storm slowed down, and he agreed reluctantly because he understood she was right, and soon they found themselves sitting in the living room again, the quiet house filled with the soft sound of wind outside and the flickering light of a small lamp near the sofa. For several minutes neither of them spoke much, watching the television without really paying attention to the program playing on the screen, and Margaret felt the familiar tension returning because she remembered how easily their previous conversations had moved into dangerous territory. Yet Daniel eventually broke the silence with a calm voice, saying he wanted to thank her for the way she had handled their earlier conversation weeks ago because her honesty had helped him understand how wrong his thoughts had been at the time. Margaret nodded without looking directly at him, saying she believed everyone experiences confusing emotions during difficult periods of life, but what matters most is how people choose to act afterward, and Daniel agreed quietly before admitting that the past few weeks had given him time to reflect on his marriage and the mistakes he almost made, explaining that loneliness had made him search for comfort in the wrong direction when he should have focused on strengthening the relationship he already had with Emily. Margaret listened carefully, relieved to hear the maturity in his words, and she gently reminded him that Emily cared deeply about him even if her demanding job sometimes kept them apart for long hours, and Daniel smiled faintly as he said he knew that now more clearly than before, because the thought of hurting Emily had forced him to see how much she truly meant to him. The snowstorm continued outside for several hours while they spoke calmly about ordinary topics like work, family traditions, and winter holidays, and slowly the tension between them softened because both of them understood the truth that needed to be acknowledged, that Daniel's feelings had never been about romance or attraction in the way he first feared but rather about emotional confusion during a lonely season of life, and once he recognized that difference the situation became easier to accept and move beyond. Eventually the storm began slowing down and the roads outside looked safer again, so Daniel stood up and prepared to leave, thanking Margaret for her patience and understanding during a situation that could have become far more complicated if she had reacted differently, and Margaret simply replied that families sometimes face uncomfortable moments but strong families learn how to protect each other instead of allowing mistakes to grow into bigger problems. Daniel paused near the door before stepping outside, turning back with a serious expression as he promised her that he would never again allow his emotions to drift beyond the boundaries of respect he owed both Margaret and Emily, and Margaret believed him because his voice carried sincerity that had not been there before, and as his car slowly disappeared down the snowy street she felt a sense of quiet relief that the situation might finally be resolved. However, even as the storm clouds cleared and silence returned to the neighborhood, Margaret remained standing near the window thinking about how easily lives can change through small emotional mistakes that begin with nothing more than loneliness and a simple conversation, and she realized that although Daniel had corrected his path and chosen to honor his marriage, the memory of those weeks would always stay somewhere in her heart as a reminder that trust, once shaken even slightly, never returns exactly the same as before. And while she hoped the future would bring peace for their family, she also sensed that the choices made during this strange chapter might one day leave deeper questions behind. Questions that neither she nor Daniel had fully answered yet. Winter slowly passed, and with the arrival of spring the quiet town where Margaret lived began to feel warm and alive again, But even as flowers returned to her garden and sunlight filled her kitchen each morning, the memories of the previous month still rested quietly in the back of her mind, because although the situation with Daniel had never turned into anything truly inappropriate, it had come close enough to leave a mark on her heart that she could not fully ignore. After the night of the snowstorm, their relationship settled into a careful balance, polite and respectful but more distant than before, and Margaret believed that distance was the safest path for everyone involved, especially for Emily, who continued living her busy life without ever knowing how fragile things had once become between the two people she trusted most. Daniel kept his promise as well, focusing his energy on rebuilding his connection with Emily, planning small trips when her schedule allowed and making time for quiet evenings together even after long workdays, and slowly, Margaret began seeing signs that their marriage was becoming stronger again, because Emily spoke about Daniel with the same warm affection she always had, often laughing as she told her mother about dinners he cooked or movies they watched together late at night, and each time Margaret listened she felt both relief and a small sting of guilt, wondering whether hiding the truth had been the right decision or simply the easiest one. Months passed and life moved forward, yet Margaret never completely forgot how easily a simple conversation could drift toward something dangerous, and sometimes when she sat alone in the evenings she thought about how different everything might have been if she had reacted differently during those quiet moments when Daniel seemed lost and uncertain. Because people rarely realize how powerful their choices are until they look back later. One warm afternoon in early summer, Emily invited Margaret to join them for a small family barbecue in their backyard, explaining happily that Daniel had spent the entire weekend fixing the garden fence and setting up a new grill he had recently bought, and Margaret accepted the invitation with a gentle smile because she knew moments like these were what truly mattered, the ordinary family gatherings that slowly rebuild trust and comfort over time. When she arrived at their house, the backyard looked beautiful under the bright sunlight, with flowers blooming along the fence and soft music playing from a small speaker near the patio table, and Daniel greeted her warmly but respectfully, the same careful kindness he had shown ever since the difficult weeks during winter, while Emily moved around the yard laughing and preparing food, completely unaware of the complicated history hidden beneath the calm surface of their family. During the afternoon they talked about simple things like summer travel plans and Emily's hope of finally taking a short vacation after months of hard work at the hospital, and Margaret watched them quietly while they joked together, noticing how Daniel reached for Emily's hand without thinking while they spoke, a small gesture that showed their bond had grown stronger again, and in that moment Margaret felt a deep sense of relief knowing that whatever confusion once existed had truly passed. Yet as the sun began to set and the warm golden light filled the yard, Emily suddenly shared a piece of news that surprised Margaret more than she expected. Explaining with a joyful smile that she and Daniel had recently started discussing the idea of moving to another state where a larger hospital had offered her a better position with more stable hours, a change that could help them start the family they had dreamed about for years. Margaret congratulated her daughter warmly because she wanted nothing more than Emily's happiness, but inside she felt a quiet sadness because the move would mean seeing them far less often. And the thought of her daughter leaving the town where they had shared so many memories made the future feel uncertain. Daniel noticed the emotion in Margaret's eyes and spoke gently, assuring her that distance would not change the family bond they shared, but his words also carried a deeper meaning that Margaret understood clearly, because both of them knew their connection had already changed in ways Emily would never fully understand. Later that evening after dinner ended and Emily stepped inside to answer a phone call from the hospital, Daniel and Margaret found themselves alone near the garden fence for the first time in many months, and for a moment neither of them spoke as they watched the quiet sky slowly darken above the trees, until Daniel finally said in a calm voice that he had often thought about the strange season of life they experienced during the previous winter, and how easily loneliness and misunderstanding could have damaged everything they cared about. Margaret nodded slowly because she had thought about it many times as well, and Daniel continued by thanking her once again for protecting the family instead of allowing his confusion to create a situation that might have broken Emily's trust forever, explaining that her strength in that moment had forced him to face the truth about his own emotions and become a better husband. Margaret listened quietly before answering that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones people must keep secret for the sake of those they love. And Daniel agreed with a thoughtful expression before promising that he would spend the rest of his life proving that Emily had chosen the right partner. Soon Emily returned outside smiling again, unaware of the quiet conversation that had just taken place, and the evening ended with warm hugs and cheerful goodbyes as Margaret prepared to return home. However, as she drove back through the peaceful streets of her small town, Margaret felt the familiar weight of memory settle gently in her chest, because although everything had ended in the best possible way, she knew she would always remember how close their family had come to a painful mistake that could have changed every relationship forever. Years later, Margaret would still think about that winter whenever she heard people speak carelessly about emotions or trust, and she would quietly remind herself that one brief moment of weakness can echo through a lifetime of memories, not because something terrible happened, but because she understood how easily it almost could have, and that realization was the reason the story of her son-in-law crossing a line would remain with her every single day, not as a scandal or a tragedy, but as a quiet lesson about love, boundaries, and the fragile strength that holds families together.